I just went for a run after work. It's 2:30 a.m. I ran for 30 minutes. And now we're going to do the martial arts workout. Let's see, are we going to listen to music or are we going to listen to audiobooks? We're going to go with audiobooks. I'm tired. I'm sore. It's not easy for me to do this workout tonight, but I'm doing it because I said I would do it. And because this is my daily routine.
Welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of To the Workers Who Support the Struggle Against the War and Against the Socialists Who Have Sided with Their Governments by Lenin from 1916. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was first published in the magazine Proletarskaya Revoluция number 5, 1924. It was written at the close of December 1916, published according to the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, Volume 23. Translated by M.S. Levin, the late Joe Feinberg, and others. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out, marxists.org. So let's get into the audiobook, which was written several years into World War I and just about a year before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The international situation is becoming increasingly clear and increasingly menacing. Both belligerent coalitions have laterally revealed the imperialist nature of the war in a very striking way. The more assiduously the capitalist governments and the bourgeois and socialist pacifists spread their empty, lying pacifist phrases, the talk of a democratic peace, a peace without annexations, etc., the sooner they are exposed. Germany is crushing several small nations under her iron heel with the very evident determination not to give up her booty except by exchanging part of it for enormous colonial possessions. And she is using hypocritical pacifist phrases as a cover for her readiness to conclude an immediate imperialist peace. England and her allies are clinging just as tightly to the colonies seized from Germany, part of Turkey, etc., claiming that in endlessly continuing the slaughter for possession of Constantinople, strangulation of Galicia, partition of Austria, the ruin of Germany, that they are fighting for a, quote, just peace. The truth, of which only a few were theoretically convinced at the beginning of the war, is now becoming palpably evident to an increasing number of class-conscious workers, namely that a serious struggle against the war, a struggle to abolish war and establish lasting peace, is out of the question unless there is a mass revolutionary struggle led by the proletariat against the government in every country, unless bourgeois rule is overthrown, unless a socialist revolution is brought about. And the war itself, which is imposing an unprecedented strain upon the peoples, is bringing mankind to this. The only way out of the impasse is compelling it to take giant strides towards state capitalism, and is demonstrating in a practical manner how planned social economy can and should be conducted, not in the interests of the capitalists, but by expropriating them, under the leadership of the revolutionary proletariat, in the interests of the masses who are now perishing from starvation and the other calamities caused by the war. The more obvious this truth becomes, the wider becomes the gulf separating the two irreconcilable tendencies, policies, trends of socialist activity, which we indicated at Simmerwald, where we acted as a separate left wing, and in a manifesto to all socialist parties and to all class-conscious workers, issued on behalf of the left wing immediately after the conference. This is the gulf that lies between the attempts to conceal the obvious bankruptcy of official socialism and its representatives' desertion to the bourgeoisie and their governments, as well as the attempts to reconcile the masses with this complete betrayal of socialism on the one hand, and on the other, the efforts to expose this bankruptcy in all its magnitude, to expose the bourgeois policy of the social patriots who have deserted the proletariat for the bourgeoisie, to destroy their influence over the masses, and to create the possibility and the organizational basis for a genuine struggle against the war. The Zimmerwald right wing, which was in the majority at the conference, fought the idea of breaking with the social patriots and founding a third international tooth and nail. Since then, the split has come to a definite fact in England, and in Germany, the last conference of the, quote, opposition on January 7, 1917, revealed to all who do not willfully shut their eyes to the facts that in that country, too, there are two irreconcilably hostile labor parties working in opposite directions. One is a socialist party, working for the most part underground, and with Karl Liebknecht as one of its leaders. The other is a thoroughly bourgeois social patriot party, which is trying to reconcile the workers to the war and to the government. The same division is to be observed in every country of the world. At the Kiental conference, the Zimmerwald right wing did not have so large a majority as to be able to continue its own policy. It voted for the resolution against the Social Patriot International Socialist Bureau, a resolution which condemned the latter in the sharpest terms, and for the resolution against social pacifism, which warned the workers against lying pacifist phrases, regardless of socialist trimmings. Socialist pacifism, which refrains from explaining to the workers the illusory nature of hopes for peace without overthrowing the bourgeoisie, organizing socialism, is merely an echo of bourgeois pacifism, which instills in the workers faith in the bourgeoisie, presents the imperialist governments and the deals they make with each other in a good light, and distracts the masses from the maturing socialist revolution, which events have put on the order of the day. But what transpired? After the Kiental conference, Zimmerwald right, in a number of important countries, in France, Germany, and Italy, slid wholly and entirely into the very social pacifism Kiental had condemned and rejected. In Italy, the Socialist Party has tacitly accepted the pacifist phrases of its parliamentary group and its principal speaker, Tirati, though precisely now, when absolutely the same phrases are being used by Germany and the Entente, and by representatives of the bourgeois governments of a number of neutral countries, where the bourgeoisie has accumulated and continues to accumulate enormous war profits, precisely now their falsehood has been exposed. In fact, pacifist phrases have proved to be a cover for the new turn in the fight for division of imperialist spoils. In Germany, Kautsky, the leader of the Zimmerwald right, issued a similar meaningless and non-committal pacifist manifesto, which merely instills in the workers hope in the bourgeoisie and faith in illusions. Genuine socialists, the genuine internationalists in Germany, the Internationale Group, and the International Socialists of Germany, who were applying Karl Liebknecht's tactics in practice, were obliged formally to dissociate themselves from this manifesto. In France, Meerheim and Borderon, who took part in the Zimmerwald conference, and Raffin Dujan, who took part in the Kiental conference, have voted for meaningless and objectively thoroughly false pacifist resolutions, which in the present state of affairs are so much to the advantage of the imperialist bourgeoisie that even Jouot and Renadel, denounced as betrayers of socialism in all the Zimmerwald and Kiental declarations, voted for them. That Meerheim voted with Jouot and Borderon and Raffin Dujan with Renadel is no accident, no isolated episode. It is a striking symbol of the imminent merger everywhere of the social patriots and social pacifists against the international socialists. The pacifist phrases in the notes of a long list of imperialist governments, the same pacifist phrases uttered by Kautsky, Tirati, Borderon, and Meerheim Renadel, extending a friendly hand to the one and the other. All this exposes pacifism in actual politics as a means of placating the people, as a means of helping the governments to condition the masses to the continuation of the imperialist slaughter. This complete bankruptcy of the Zimmerwald flight has been still more strikingly revealed in Switzerland, the only European country where the Zimmerwaldists could meet freely, and which served as their base. The Socialist Party of Switzerland, which has held its congresses during the war without interference from the government, and is in a better position than any other party to promote international solidarity between the German, French, and Italian workers against the war, has officially affiliated to Zimmerwald. And yet, on a decisive question affecting a proletarian party, one of this party's leaders, the chairman of the Zimmerwald and Kiental conferences, a prominent member and representative of the Bern International Socialist Committee, National Councillor R. Grimm, deserted to the social patriots of his country. At the meeting of the Parteivorstand of the Socialist Party of Switzerland on January 7, 1917, he secured the adoption of a decision to postpone indefinitely the party congress, which was to be convened for the express purpose of deciding the fatherland defense issue and the party's attitude towards the Kiental Conference decisions condemning social pacifism. In a manifesto signed by the International Socialist Committee and dated December 1916, Grimm describes as hypocritical pacifist phrases of the governments, but says not a word about the socialist pacifism that unites Merheim and Jouot, Raffin Dujean, and Renaudel. In this manifesto, Grimm urges the socialist minorities to fight the governments and their social patriot hirelings. At the same time, jointly with the social patriot hirelings in the Swiss party, he endeavors to bury the party congress, thus rousing the just indignation of all the class-conscious and sincerely internationalist Swiss workers. No excuses can conceal the fact that the Parteivorstand, or executive decision of January 7, 1917, signifies the complete victory of the Swiss social patriots over the Swiss socialist workers, the victory of the Swiss opponents of Zimmerwald over Zimmerwald. The Grütlianer, that organ of the consistent and avowed servants of the bourgeoisie in the labor movement, said what everyone knows is true when it declared that social patriots of the Greulich and Pfluger type, to whom should be added Seidel, Huber, Lang, Schneeberger, Durr, etc., want to prevent the Congress from being held, want to prevent the workers from deciding the fatherland defense issue, and threaten to resign if the Congress is held and a decision in the spirit of Zimmerwald is adopted. Grimm resorted to an outrageous and intolerable falsehood at the Parteivorstand and in his newspaper, the Berner Tagblatt of January 8, 1917, when he claimed that the Congress had to be postponed because the workers were not ready, that it was necessary to campaign against the high cost of living, that the, quote, left were themselves in favor of postponement, etc. In reality, it was the left, i.e. the sincere Zimmerwaldists, who, anxious to choose the lesser of two evils and also to expose the real intentions of the social patriots and their new friend, Grimm, proposed postponing the Congress until March, voted to postpone it until May, and suggested that the meetings of the cantonal committees be held before July. But all these proposals were voted down by the fatherland defenders, led by the chairman of the Zimmerwald and Kiental conferences, Robert Grimm. In reality, the question was, shall the Bern International Socialist Committee and Grimm's paper be allowed to hurl abuse at foreign social patriots and, at first by their silence and then by Grimm's desertion, shield the Swiss social patriots? Or shall an honest internationalist policy be pursued, a policy of fighting primarily the social patriots at home? In reality, the question was, shall the domination of the social patriots and reformists in the Swiss party be concealed by revolutionary phrases, or shall we oppose to them a revolutionary program and tactics on the question of combating the high cost of living, as well as of combating the war, of putting on the order of the day the fight for the socialist revolution? In reality, the question was, shall the worst traditions of the ignominiously bankrupt Second International be continued in Zimmerwald? Shall the leaders be kept ignorant of the things the party leaders do and say at the Parteivorstand? Shall revolutionary phrases be allowed to cover up the vileness of social patriotism and reformism? Or shall we be internationalists in deeds? In reality, the question was, shall we in Switzerland too, where the party is of primary importance for the whole of the Zimmerwald group, insist upon a clear, principled, and politically honest division between the social patriots and the internationalists, between the bourgeois reformists and the revolutionaries, between the councillors of the proletariat who are helping it carry out the socialist revolution and the bourgeois agents or hirelings who want to divert the workers from revolution by means of reforms or promises of reforms, between the Grutlians and the Socialist Party, or shall we confuse and corrupt the minds of the workers by conducting in the Socialist Party the Grutlian policy of the Grutlians, i.e. the social patriots in the ranks of the Socialist Party? Let the Swiss social patriots, those Grutlians who want to operate their Grutlian policy, i.e. the policy of their national bourgeoisie, abuse the foreigners. Let them defend the inviolability of the Swiss party from criticism by other parties. Let them champion the old bourgeois reformist policy, i.e. the very policy that brought on the collapse of the German and other parties on August 4, 1914. We, who adhere to Zimmerwald in deeds and not merely in words, interpret internationalism differently. We are not prepared passively to regard the efforts, now definitely revealed and sanctified by the chairman of the Zimmerwald and Kiental conferences, to leave everything unchanged in decaying European socialism and, by means of hypocritical professions of solidarity with Karl Liebknecht, to bypass the real slogan of this leader of the international workers, his appeal to work for the regeneration of the old parties from top to bottom. We are convinced that on our side are all the class-conscious workers in all countries, who enthusiastically greeted Karl Liebknecht and his tactics. We openly expose the Zimmerwald right, which has deserted to bourgeois reformist pacifism. We openly expose Grimm's betrayal of Zimmerwald and demand convocation of a conference to remove him from his post on the International Socialist Committee. The word Zimmerwald is the slogan of international socialism and revolutionary struggle. This word must not serve to shield social patriotism and bourgeois reformism. Stand for true internationalism, which calls for the struggle, first of all, against the social patriots in your own country. Stand for true revolutionary tactics, which are impossible if there is a compromise with the social patriots against the revolutionary socialist workers. That is the end of the audiobook. So, up on the channel, I just put 8, this is the 8th in the series, texts from Lenin, all short texts between 10 and 30 minutes basically, about nationalism and war. Lenin, of course, was writing about World War I and the rank betrayals that were going on within the world of socialism. Of course, what we know as communism or Marxism-Leninism broke away from this, established the Third Communist International, and set new standards for what it meant to be a Marxist. And I think that sadly, we need to relearn a lot of these lessons today. That's why I'm posting this. Also, we are covering more material about the emerging war, looking likely, between the US, EU, or NATO on one side, and Russia and its allies on the other. Open hostilities have not quite broken out yet, but it's a lot closer to open hostilities than it's been in a long time. And there are all kinds of social patriots. You look at somebody like a Vosh, people who claim to be socialist or whatever the hell he's claiming to be these days, but wind up just basically being Democrats, just wind up supporting the United States and its imperialism. And then other contrarian opportunists. Vosh is an opportunist of one type, and then there are opportunists of a contrarian bent who do the same thing. They side with a bourgeoisie, just not the United States, but same difference. I mean, we're talking about global capitalism at this point, fighting for liberation of the working class. This is a class struggle, and aligning with any bourgeoisie is equally traitorous. There is so much work that needs to be done if the working class is going to have any kind of a revolutionary moment in the next, 10 to 20 years. And we got to step on it. What can I say? So, did these texts to kind of lay the groundwork for that in this August 2022 edition of Socialism for All. And we're going to read next some texts very similar to what Lenin has done in these texts from modern-day communists such as the Union of Communists of Ukraine, which make very similar calls. Anyway, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Socialism for All. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. Really appreciate it. They've allowed me to spend a lot more time creating content for this channel than I would have been able to do without that support. So again, much appreciated. If you like this channel, thank a patron, possibly become one. That support really matters. Then, after the content has been produced, engagement counts. So like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that helps to encourage YouTube to recommend this content to more people. The audience has been expanding, and we want to see it keep expanding. This is a time of crisis for capitalism, and we really need to improve the left through agitation, education, and then organization. The organization part has to occur in your community with you. So look around, connect with whatever parties are in your area. If you're in a very desolate area, or like very rural, remote, then see if you can connect with something on the state, or maybe even the national level. But really, the organization needs to happen. Just having isolated individuals standing around wondering when things are going to change is not going to cut it. This is history that we have to write, and that means you. All right, thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The Socialist Revolution and the Right of Nations to Self-Determination by Lenin from 1916. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was written January and February 1916. It was published in April 1916 in the magazine Svoboda number 2, printed in Russia in October 1916 in Spornik Social-Demokrata number 1. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Moscow, volume 22, transcription by Richard Boss, and HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters. It's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's begin the audiobook. Section 1, Imperialism, Socialism, and the Liberation of Oppressed Nations. Imperialism is the highest stage of development of capitalism. Capital in the advanced countries has outgrown the boundaries of national states. It has established monopoly in place of competition, thus creating all the objective prerequisites for the achievement of socialism. Hence, in Western Europe and in the United States of America, the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat for the overthrow of the capitalist governments, for the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, is on the order of the day. Imperialism is forcing the masses into this struggle by sharpening class antagonisms to an immense degree, by worsening the conditions of the masses both economically, trusts and high cost of living, and politically, growth of militarism, frequent wars, increase of reaction, strengthening and extension of national oppression, and colonial plunder. Victorious socialism must achieve complete democracy and, consequently, not only bring about the complete equality of nations, but also give effect to the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, i.e. the right to free political secession. Socialist parties which fail to prove by all their activities now, as well as during the revolution and after its victory, that they will free the enslaved nations and establish relations with them on the basis of a free union, and, note, a free union is a lying phrase without the right to secession. Such parties would be committing treachery to socialism. Of course, democracy is also a form of state which must disappear when the state disappears, but this will take place only in the process of transition from completely victorious and consolidated socialism to complete communism. 2. The Socialist Revolution and the Struggle for Democracy. The Socialist Revolution is not one single act, not one single battle on a single front, but a whole epoch of intensified class conflicts, a long series of battles on all fronts, i.e., battles around all the problems of economics and politics, which can culminate only in the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. It would be a fundamental mistake to suppose that the struggle for democracy can divert the proletariat from the socialist revolution, or obscure or overshadow it, etc. On the contrary, just as socialism cannot be victorious unless it introduces complete democracy, so the proletariat will be unable to prepare for victory over the bourgeoisie unless it wages a many-sided, consistent, and revolutionary struggle for democracy. it would be no less mistaken to delete any of the points of the democratic program, for example, the point of self-determination of nations, on the ground that it is, quote, infeasible, or that it is, quote, illusory under imperialism. The assertion that the right of nations to self-determination cannot be achieved within the framework of capitalism may be understood either in its absolute economic sense or in the conventional political sense. In the first case, the assertion is fundamentally wrong in theory. First, in this sense, it is impossible to achieve such things as labor money or the abolition of crises, etc., under capitalism. But it is entirely incorrect to argue that the self-determination of nations is likewise infeasible. Secondly, even the one example of the secession of Norway from Sweden in 1905 is sufficient to refute the argument that it is infeasible in this sense. Thirdly, it would be ridiculous to deny that with a slight change in political and strategical relationships, for example, between England and Germany, the formation of new states, Polish, Indian, etc., would be quite feasible very soon. Fourthly, finance capital, in its striving towards expansion, will freely buy and bribe the freest, most democratic, and republican government and the elected officials of any country, however, quote, independent it may be. The domination of finance capital, as of capital in general, cannot be abolished by any kind of reforms in the realm of political democracy, and self-determination belongs wholly and exclusively to this realm. The domination of finance capital, however, does not in the least destroy the significance of political democracy as the freer, wider, and more distinct form of class oppression and class struggle. Hence, all arguments about the, quote, impossibility of achieving, economically, one of the demands of political democracy under capitalism, reduce themselves to a theoretically incorrect definition of the general and fundamental relations of capitalism and of political democracy in general. In the second case, this assertion is incomplete and inaccurate, for not only the right of nations to self-determination, but all the fundamental demands of political democracy are possible of achievement under imperialism only in an incomplete and in mutilated form, and as a rare exception, for example, the secession of Norway from Sweden in 1905. The demand for the immediate liberation of the colonies, as advanced by all revolutionary social democrats, is also impossible of achievement under capitalism without a series of revolutions. This does not imply, however, that social democracy must refrain from conducting an immediate and most determined struggle for all these demands. To refrain would merely be to the advantage of the bourgeoisie and reaction. On the contrary, it implies that it is necessary to formulate and put forward all these demands, not in a reformist, but in a revolutionary way, not by keeping within the framework of bourgeois legality, but by breaking through it, not by confining oneself to parliamentary speeches and verbal protests, but by drawing the masses into real action, by widening and fomenting the struggle for every kind of fundamental democratic demand, right up to and including the direct onslaught of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, i.e. to the socialist revolution, which will expropriate the bourgeoisie. The socialist revolution may break out not only in consequence of a great strike, a street demonstration, a hunger riot, a mutiny in the forces, or a colonial rebellion, but also in consequence of any political crisis, like the Dreyfus Affair, Sovereign Incident, or in connection with a referendum on the secession of an oppressed nation, etc. The intensification of national oppression under imperialism makes it necessary for social democracy, that was the general term for Marxism in those days, not to renounce what the bourgeoisie describes as the, quote, utopian struggle for the freedom of nations to secede, but on the contrary, to take more advantage than ever before of conflicts arising also on this ground, for the purpose of rousing mass action and revolutionary attacks upon the bourgeoisie. 3. The meaning of the right to self-determination and its relation to federation. The right of nations to self-determination means only the right to independence in a political sense, the right to free political secession from the oppressing nation. Concretely, this political, democratic demand implies complete freedom to carry on agitation in favor of secession, and freedom to settle the question of secession by means of a referendum of the nation that desires to secede. Consequently, this demand is by no means identical with the demand for secession, for partition, for the formation of small states. It is merely the logical expression of the struggle against national oppression in every form. The more closely the democratic system of state approximates to complete freedom of secession, the rarer and weaker will the striving for secession be in practice. For the advantages of large states, both from the point of view of economic progress and from the point of view of the interests of the masses, are beyond doubt, and these advantages increase with the growth of capitalism. The recognition of self-determination is not the same as making federation a principle. One may be a determined opponent of this principle and a partisan of democratic centralism, and yet prefer federation to national inequality as the only path towards complete democratic centralism. It was precisely from this point of view that Marx, although a centralist, preferred even the federation of Ireland with England to the forcible subjection of Ireland to the English. The aim of socialism is not only to abolish the present division of mankind into small states and all national isolation, not only to bring the nations closer to each other, but also to merge them. And in order to achieve this aim, we must, on the one hand, explain to the masses the reactionary nature of the ideas of Renner and Otto Bauer concerning so-called cultural national autonomy, and on the other hand, demand the liberation of the oppressed nations, not only in general nebulous phrases, not in empty declamations, not by postponing the question until socialism is established, but in a clearly and precisely formulated political program, which shall particularly take into account the hypocrisy and cowardice of the socialists in the oppressing nations. Just as mankind can achieve the abolition of classes only by passing through the transition period of the dictatorship of the oppressed class, so mankind can achieve the inevitable merging of nations only by passing through the transition period of complete liberation of all the oppressed nations, i.e. their freedom to secede. 4. The proletarian revolutionary presentation of the question of the self-determination of nations. Not only the demand for the self-determination of nations, but all the items of our democratic minimum program were advanced before us as far back as the 17th and 18th centuries by the petty bourgeoisie. And the petty bourgeoisie, believing in peaceful capitalism, continues to this day to advance all these demands in a utopian way, without seeing the class struggle and the fact that it has become intensified under democracy. The idea of a peaceful union of equal nations under imperialism, which deceives the people, and which the Kautskyists advocate, is precisely of this nature. As against this Philistine, opportunist utopia, the program of social democracy must point out that under imperialism, the division of nations into oppressing and oppressed ones is a fundamental, most important, and inevitable fact. The proletariat of the oppressing nations cannot confine itself to the general hackneyed phrases against annexations and for the equal rights of nations in general that may be repeated by any pacifist bourgeois. The proletariat cannot evade the question that is particularly unpleasant for the imperialist bourgeoisie, namely the question of the frontiers of a state that is based on national oppression. The proletariat cannot but fight against the forcible retention of the oppressed nations within the boundaries of a given state, and this is exactly what the struggle for the right of self-determination means. The proletariat must demand the right of political secession for the colonies and for the nations that, quote, its own nation oppresses. Unless it does this, proletarian internationalism will remain a meaningless phrase. Mutual confidence and class solidarity between the workers of the oppressing and oppressed nations will be impossible. The hypocrisy of the reformist and Kautskyan advocates of self-determination who maintain silence about the nations which are oppressed by their nation and forcibly retained within their state will remain unexposed. The socialists of the oppressed nations, on the other hand, must particularly fight for and maintain complete, absolute unity, also organizational unity, between the workers of the oppressed nation and the workers of the oppressing nation. Without such unity, it will be impossible to maintain an independent proletarian policy and class solidarity with the proletariat of other countries in the face of all the subterfuge, treachery, and trickery of the bourgeoisie. For the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nations always converts the slogan of national liberation into a means for deceiving the workers. In internal politics, it utilizes these slogans as a means for concluding reactionary agreements with the bourgeoisie of the ruling nation. For instance, the Poles in Austria and Russia, who entered into pacts with reaction in order to oppress the Jews and the Ukrainians. In the realm of foreign politics, it strives to enter into pacts with one of the rival imperialist powers for the purpose of achieving its own predatory aims. policies of the small states in the Balkans, etc. The fact that the struggle for national liberation against one imperial power may, under certain circumstances, be utilized by another great power in its equally imperialist interests should have no more weight in inducing social democracy to renounce its recognition of the right of nations to self-determination than the numerous cases of the bourgeoisie utilizing Republican slogans for the purpose of political deception and financial robbery, for example, in the Latin countries, have had in inducing them to renounce republicanism. Footnote from Lenin there. Needless to say, to repudiate the right of self-determination on the ground that it logically means defense of the fatherland would be quite ridiculous. With equal logic, i.e. with equal shallowness, the social chauvinists of 1914 to 16, here Lenin is referring to the socialists of the Second International who told the workers to support the bourgeois war, World War I, and to side with, quote, their own national bourgeoisies. Apply this argument to every one of the demands of democracy, for instance, to republicanism, and to every formulation of the struggle against national oppression in order to justify defense of the fatherland. Marxism arrives at the recognition of defense of the fatherland, for example, in the wars of the Great French Revolution and the Garibaldi Wars in Europe, and at the repudiation of defense of the fatherland in the imperialist war of 1914 to 16, from the analysis of the specific historical circumstances of each separate war, and not from some general principle or some separate item of a program. 5. Marxism and Proudhonism on the national question. In contrast to the petty bourgeois Democrats, Marx regarded all democratic demands without exception, not as an absolute, but as a historical expression of the struggle of the masses of the people, led by the bourgeoisie, against feudalism. There's not a single democratic demand which could not serve, and has not served, under certain conditions, as an instrument of the bourgeoisie for deceiving the workers. To single out one of the demands of political democracy, namely the self-determination of nations, and to oppose it to all the rest, is fundamentally wrong in theory. In practice, the proletariat will be able to retain its independence only if it subordinates its struggle for all the democratic demands, not excluding the demand for a republic, to its revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Comment. I'd just like to pause there for a minute. So Lenin is talking here specifically about the national question and the self-determination of nations, but let's take this principle in general because I think that it explains some of the confusion that, for example, SOCDEMs have about socialism and, sort of their buy-in to a lot of the talk about, quote, authoritarianism and things like that. I think that this paragraph really speaks to the heart of that controversy in question. So let's read it again. In contrast to the petty bourgeois Democrats, Marx regarded all democratic demands without exception not as an absolute, but as a historical expression of the struggle of the masses of the people, led by the bourgeoisie against feudalism. There is not a single democratic demand which could not serve, and has not served under certain conditions, as an instrument of the bourgeoisie for deceiving the workers. So to comment on that, in other words, this is, in a certain sense, the bourgeoisie's struggle first, because they're the ones who are going to benefit as the next ruling class after feudalism. Why deceiving the workers? Well, the workers could easily continue the struggle on, not just overthrowing feudalism, but also overthrowing capitalism. But the bourgeoisie doesn't want that, so they have to manipulate and deceive the workers into thinking that capitalism is the end of the line, or that if you go further than that, it necessarily lapses into some sort of, quote, tyranny. Anyway, to continue, to single out one of the demands of political democracy, namely the self-determination of nations, and oppose it to all the rest is fundamentally wrong in theory. So Lenin's saying that there are many demands of political democracy, self-determination of nations being one of them, and self-determination of nations is no different in terms of being an instrument of the bourgeoisie potentially for deceiving the workers. So that's wrong in theory, and continuing, in practice, the proletariat will be able to retain its independence, i.e. from the bourgeoisie. This is something we're really struggling with today, particularly in that SOCDEM world of buying into bourgeois interests, basically. That's a poor example. In other words, that's where the proletariat is not able to separate out and keep independent its own interests from those of the bourgeoisie. Confusion of interests, and you get class collaboration there. Anyway, in practice, the proletariat will be able to retain its independence only if It subordinates its struggle for all the democratic demands, not excluding the demand for a republic, to its revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. In other words, keep your eye on the prize. That is the thing to which we must subordinate all other demands, is the revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. That's what comes first. You must always keep that in mind. Continuing. On the other hand, in contrast to the Proudhonists, who, quote, repudiated the national problem, quote, in the name of the social revolution, Marx, having in mind mainly the interests of the proletarian class struggle in the advanced countries, put into the forefront the fundamental principle of internationalism and socialism, viz., that no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. It was precisely from the standpoint of the interests of the revolutionary movement of the German workers that Marx, in 1848, demanded that victorious democracy in Germany should proclaim and grant freedom to the nations that the Germans were oppressing. It was precisely from the standpoint of the revolutionary struggle of the English workers that Marx, in 1869, demanded the separation of Ireland from England, and added, quote, although after the separation there may come federation. Only by putting forward this demand did Marx really educate the English workers in the spirit of internationalism. Only in this way was he able to oppose the revolutionary solution of a given historical problem to the opportunists and bourgeois reformism, which even now, half a century later, has failed to achieve the Irish reform. Only in this way was Marx able, unlike the apologists of capital who shout about the right of small nations to secession being utopian and impossible, and about the progressive nature not only of economic, but also of political concentration, to urge the progressive nature of this concentration in a non-imperialist manner, to urge the bringing together of the nations not by force, but on the basis of a free union of the proletarians of all countries. Only in this way was Marx able, also in the sphere of the solution of national problems, to oppose the revolutionary action of the masses to verbal and often hypocritical recognition of the equality and self-determination of nations. The imperialist war of 1914-16 and the Augean stables of hypocrisy of the opportunists and Kautskyists it exposed have strikingly confirmed the correctness of Marx's policy, which must serve as the model for all the advanced countries, for all of them now oppress other nations. There's a Lenin footnote there. Unfortunately, most of it is missing. It says, reference is often made, e.g. recently by the German, and then most is missing, and it says defend the latter, and then the rest is missing. 6. 3 types of countries in relation to self-determination of nations. In this respect, countries must be divided into 3 main types. First, the advanced capitalist countries of Western Europe and the United States of America. In these countries, the bourgeois, progressive, national movements came to an end long ago. Every one of these, quote, great nations oppresses other nations in the colonies and within its own country. The tasks of the proletariat of these ruling nations are the same as those of the proletariat in England in the 19th century in relation to Ireland. Secondly, Eastern Europe, Austria, the Balkans, and particularly Russia. Here, it was the 20th century that particularly developed the bourgeois democratic national movements and intensified the national struggle. The tasks of the proletariat in these countries, in regard to the consummation of their bourgeois democratic reformation, as well as in regard to assisting the socialist revolution in other countries, cannot be achieved unless it champions the right of nations to self-determination. In this connection, the most difficult but most important task is to merge the class struggle of the workers in the oppressing nations with the class struggle of the workers in the oppressed nations. Let's read that last sentence again. In this connection, the most difficult but most important task is to merge the class struggle of the workers in the oppressing nations with the class struggle of the workers in the oppressed nations. Lenin is not saying that this is easy. He's recognizing it's difficult, but also important. Thirdly, the semi-colonial countries like China, Persia, Turkey, and all the colonies, which have a combined population amounting to 1 billion. In these countries, the bourgeois democratic movements have either hardly begun or are far from having been completed. Socialists must not only demand the unconditional and immediate liberation of the colonies without compensation, and this demand, in its political expression, signifies nothing more nor less than the recognition of the right to self-determination, but must render determined support to the more revolutionary elements in the bourgeois democratic movements for national liberation in these countries, and assist their rebellion, and, if need be, their revolutionary war against the imperialist powers that oppress them. 7. Social chauvinism and self-determination of nations. The imperialist epic and the War of 1914-16 have particularly brought to the forefront the task of fighting against chauvinism and nationalism in the advanced countries. On the question of the self-determination of nations, there are two main shades of opinion among the social chauvinists, i.e. the opportunists and the Kautskyists, who embellished the reactionary imperialist war by declaring it to be a war, quote, in defense of the fatherland. On the one hand, we see the rather avowed servants of the bourgeoisie who defend annexations on the ground that imperialism and political concentration are progressive, and who repudiate the right to self-determination on the ground that it is utopian, illusory, petty bourgeois, etc. Among these may be included Kuhnau, Parvis, and the extreme opportunists in Germany, a section of the Fabians and the trade union leaders in England, and the opportunists, Semkovsky, Liebman, Yurkovich, etc. in Russia. On the other hand, we see the Kautskyists, including Vandervelde, Renadel, and many of the pacifists in England, France, etc. These stand for unity with the first mentioned group, and in practice their conduct is the same in that they advocate the right to self-determination in a purely verbal and hypocritical way. They regard the demand for the freedom of political secession as being, quote, excessive, zu viel verlangt, too much longed for, too much desired, quoting Kautsky in Die Neue Zeit, May 21st, 1915. They do not advocate the need for revolutionary tactics, especially for the socialists in the oppressing nations. But on the contrary, they gloss over their revolutionary duties. They justify their opportunism, they make it easier to deceive the people, they evade precisely the question of the frontiers of a state which forcibly retains subject nations, etc. Both groups are opportunists who prostitute Marxism and who have lost all capacity to understand the theoretical significance and the practical urgency of Marx's tactics, an example of which he gave in relation to Ireland. The specific question of annexations has become a particularly urgent one owing to the war. But what is an annexation? Clearly, to protest against annexations implies either the recognition of the right of self-determination of nations, or that the protest is based on a pacifist phrase which defends the status quo and opposes all violence, including revolutionary violence. Such a phrase is radically wrong and incompatible with Marxism. 8. The concrete tasks of the proletariat in the immediate future. The socialist revolution may begin in the very near future. In that event, the proletariat will be faced with the immediate task of capturing power, of expropriating the banks, and of introducing other dictatorial measures. In such a situation, the bourgeoisie, and particularly intellectuals like the Fabians and the Kautskyists, will strive to disrupt and to hinder the revolution, to restrict it to limited democratic aims. While all purely democratic demands may, at a time when the proletarians have already begun to storm the bulwarks of bourgeois power, serve in a certain sense as a hindrance to the revolution, nevertheless, the necessity of proclaiming and granting freedom to all oppressed nations, i.e. their right to self-determination, will be as urgent in the socialist revolution as it was urgent for the victory of the bourgeois democratic revolution, for example, in Germany in 1848 or in Russia in 1905. Quick comment here. What does Lenin mean that while all purely democratic demands may at a time serve as a hindrance to the revolution? Lenin has written about this in other works, specifically when the possibility of socialist revolution, the abolition of capitalism, becomes possible, i.e. you are in an active revolutionary moment where the abolition of capitalism is actually within reach, a real option on the table in that moment. Then, and basically only then, is it a hindrance to put bourgeois liberties ahead of that revolution. In other words, we want all the bourgeois liberties and freedoms that we can get for the purpose of waging the class war. But once we get up to the revolutionary moment, fuck them, get the revolution. That's like the whole point of workers striving for the liberties that the bourgeoisie will grant you under capitalism, is specifically to get up to that moment where you can end capitalism. They serve no purpose after that, because bourgeois liberties mean that the bourgeoisie is still in power. Once socialist revolution becomes possible, then we'll take it from there, after the proletariat has set up a new system in the wake of abolishing capitalism. So we can proceed with proletarian democracy from there. But what Lenin is saying is that the one bourgeois democratic right that will still be that important is the necessity of proclaiming and granting freedom to all the oppressed nations, i.e. their right to self-determination. He says, quote, "It will be as urgent in the socialist revolution as it was urgent for the victory of the bourgeois democratic revolution, for example, in Germany in 1848 or Russia in 1905. So if when you're doing that socialist revolution, you're not proclaiming and granting freedom to all oppressed nations, you're fucking up your own revolution. It is, as Lenin says, a necessity and urgent." All right, continuing. However, 5, 10, and even more years may pass before the socialist revolution begins. In that case, the task will be to educate the masses in a revolutionary spirit so as to make it impossible for socialist chauvinists and opportunists to belong to the Workers' Party and to achieve a victory similar to that of 1914 to 16. Another quick comment, this is exactly what we're trying to do now, clearing out the PATSOCs, clearing about the radlib pro-USA opportunists like Vosh, etc. We're trying to clear out, make it impossible for socialist chauvinists and opportunists to belong to the Workers' Party, to have an immediate influence, etc. Anyway, continuing. It will be the duty of the socialists to explain to the masses that English socialists who failed to demand the freedom of secession for the colonies and for Ireland, that German socialists who failed to demand the freedom of secession for the colonies, for the Alsatians, for the Danes, and for the Poles, and who failed to carry direct revolutionary propaganda and revolutionary mass action to the field of struggle against national oppression, who failed to take advantage of cases like the Zabern incident to conduct widespread underground propaganda among the proletariat of the oppressing nation, to organize street demonstrations and revolutionary mass actions, that Russian socialists who failed to demand freedom of secession for Finland, Poland, the Ukraine, etc., are behaving like chauvinists, like lackeys of the blood and mud-stained imperialist monarchies and the imperialist bourgeoisie. So that's the end of that section. You can hear how important this is to Lenin, that every country, all of the advanced countries which are oppressing other countries, if it is not one of the paramount, first and foremost things that the proletariat of the oppressing nations is instructed in, is to support the freedom of secession for the colonies, for all the nations that are being oppressed, then this is just a total failure. You're behaving like chauvinists, quote, like lackeys of the blood and mud-stained imperialist monarchies and the imperialist bourgeoisie. So I think that we are learning that lesson, but again, as we increase the organization, as we increase the education, etc., this is a point that is going to really have to be expounded on, emphasized, brought up in 100 different ways over the course of subsequent years so that people really get the message, get many different examples of it, have exposure to many different discussions of particular situations. That's going to be really important. 9. The attitude of Russian and Polish social democracy and of the Second International to self-determination. The difference between the revolutionary social democrats of Russia and the Polish social democrats on the question of self-determination came to the surface as early as 1903 at the Congress which adopted the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and which, despite the protest of the Polish Social Democratic delegation, inserted in that program point 9, which recognizes the right of nations to self-determination. Since then, the Polish Social Democrats have never repeated, in the name of their party, the proposal to delete point 9 from our program, or to substitute some other formulation for it. In Russia, where no less than 57%, i.e. over 100 million of the population, belong to oppressed nations, where those nations mainly inhabit the border provinces, where some of those nations are more cultured than the Great Russians, where the political system is distinguished by its particularly barbarous and medieval character, where the bourgeois democratic revolution has not yet been completed, the recognition of the right of the nations oppressed by Tsarism to free secession from Russia is absolutely obligatory for social democracy in the interests of its democratic and socialist tasks. Our party, which was re-established in January 1912, adopted a resolution in 1913, reiterating the right to self-determination and explaining it in the concrete sense outlined above. The orgy of Great Russian chauvinism raging in 1914 to 16 among the bourgeoisie and the opportunist socialists, Rubanovich, Plekhanov, Nachyedielo, etc., prompts us to insist on this demand more strongly than ever and to declare that those who reject it serve in practice as a bulwark of Great Russian chauvinism and Tsarism. Our party declares that it emphatically repudiates all responsibility for such opposition to the right of self-determination. The latest formulation of the position of Polish social democracy on the national question, a declaration made by Polish social democracy at the Zimmerwald Conference, contains the following ideas. This declaration condemns the German and other governments which regard the, quote, Polish provinces as a hostage in the forthcoming game of compensations and thus, quote, deprive the Polish people of the opportunity to decide their own fate. The declaration says, quote, Polish social democracy emphatically and solemnly protests against the recarving and partition of a whole country. It condemns the socialists who left the Hohenzollerns, quote, the task of liberating the oppressed nations. It expresses the conviction that only participation in the impending struggle of the revolutionary international proletariat in the struggle for socialism, quote, will break the fetters of national oppression and abolish all forms of foreign domination, and secure for the Polish people the possibility of all-sided, free development as an equal member in a League of Nations, unquote. The declaration also recognizes the present war to be, quote, doubly fratricidal, quote, for the Poles. There is no difference in substance between these postulates and the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination, except that their political formulation is still more diffuse and vague than the majority of the programs and resolutions of the Second International. Any attempt to express these ideas in precise political formulae and to determine whether they apply to the capitalist system or only to the socialist system will prove still more strikingly the error committed by the Polish Social Democrats in repudiating the self-determination of nations. The decision of the International Socialist Congress, held in London in 1896, which recognized the self-determination of nations, must, on the basis of the above-mentioned postulates, be supplemented by references to 1. The particular urgency of this demand under imperialism. 2. The politically conditional nature and the class content of all the demands of political democracy, including this demand. 3. The necessity of drawing a distinction between the concrete tasks of the Social Democrats in the oppressing nations and those in oppressed nations. 4. The inconsistent, purely verbal, and therefore, as far as its political significance is concerned, hypocritical recognition of self-determination by the opportunists and Kautskyists. 5. The actual identity of the chauvinists and those social democrats, particularly the social democrats of the great powers, such as the great Russians, Anglo-Americans, Germans, French, Italians, Japanese, etc., who failed to champion the freedom of secession for the colonies and nations oppressed by, quote, their own nations. 6. The necessity of subordinating the struggle for this demand, as well as for all the fundamental demands of political democracy, to the immediate revolutionary mass struggle for the overthrow of the bourgeois governments and for the achievement of socialism. To transplant to the international the point of view of some of the small nations, particularly the point of view of the Polish Social Democrats, who, in their struggle against the Polish bourgeoisie, which is deceiving the people with nationalist slogans, were misled into repudiating self-determination, would be a theoretical error. It would be the substitution of Proudhonism for Marxism, and in practice, it would result in rendering involuntary support to the most dangerous chauvinism and opportunism of the great power nations. Editorial Board of Social Democrat, central organ of the RSDLP. Postscript. In Die Neue Zeit for March 3, 1916, which has just appeared, Kautsky openly holds out the hand of Christian reconciliation to Austerlitz, a representative of the foulest German chauvinism, rejecting freedom of separation for the oppressed powers of Habsburg Austria, but recognizing it for Russian Poland as a menial service to Hindenburg and Wilhelm II. One could not have wished for a better self-exposure of Kautskyism. That's the end of the piece proper. However, there is a companion piece, a note to the theses, Socialist Revolution and the Right of Nations to Self-Determination, written by Lenin around the same time. It goes like this. There is some similarity between the way mankind should arrive at the abolition of classes and the way it should subsequently arrive at the fusion of nations. Thus, only a transitional stage of dictatorship by the oppressed class leads to the abolition of classes. Only the liberation of the oppressed nations and real eradication of national oppression leads to the fusion of nations, and the political criterion of this feasibility lies precisely in the freedom to secede. Freedom to secede is the best and the only political means against the idiotic system of petty states and national isolation, which, to mankind's good fortune, is being inexorably destroyed by the whole course of capitalist development. That's the end of the note and of the entire audiobook. So, What did you think? I gave my comments earlier. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section below. Leave a question or comment, and we'll take it up there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and have allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I would have been able to do without that financial support. We don't run ads on this channel, so again, the patron support is vital. Thank you all very much for those contributions. Then, after the content is produced and uploaded, engagement counts. This goes for everyone. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, even if it's random letters, good video, thanks, whatever. All of that helps YouTube, as well as SoundCloud and anywhere else that this content may be posted in the future, to be recommended to more people. So you can share it on your own social media. That's great. If you tag me, I'll probably repost or retweet your post of it. But even if you don't have a prominent social media account, just again, the engagement, the liking, sharing, subscribing, you're going to indirectly help to put it in the hands of more people by YouTube's recommendations. Beyond that, organization counts, and it's one of the things we can't do through a YouTube channel, but look in your local community for organizations, parties, and other workers' movement, pieces of struggle that you can get involved in and support. That ultimately is what it's going to take in the end, real world action. Yes, you can learn things online, you can agitate and educate. The organizing, that happens out in meat space. It happens in many different forms: labor unions, community unions, tenant unions, all kinds of other mutual aid support organizations, political parties, on and on. Get involved in what you can. If there's nothing immediately in your area, maybe you can contribute resources or just join on more of a statewide or national level at this point, and maybe in the future there will be more people in your area. But do look around and get involved in some organized activity. Thanks again for listening, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is October 12, 2020, and this is an audiobook of The Tasks of the Proletariat in the Present Revolution, also known as the April Theses by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So I'm reading off of the copy from Marxists.org. This work was originally published April 7, 1917 in Pravda number 26, signed N. Lenin, published according to the newspaper Text. The source is Lenin's Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, volume 24, pages 19 to 26, translated by Isaacs Bernard, transcription by Zodiac, HTML by Brian Baggins, public domain, Lenin Internet Archive 2005, Marx.org 1997, Marxists.org 1999. Thanks very much to Marxists.org, the Marxists Internet Archive, for hosting this and thousands of other Marxist works. It's a major source for what we read here at Socialism for All, and I highly recommend that you check it out. So, getting into the text here, there is a very brief preface. This article contains Lenin's famous April Theses, read by him at 2 meetings of the All-Russia Conference of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies on April 4, 1917. I will also comment myself, of course, this was the year of the October Revolution, so a major, major year in world socialist history. Introduction. I did not arrive in Petrograd until the night of April 3rd, and therefore at the meeting on April 4, I could of course deliver the report on the tasks of the revolutionary proletariat only on my own behalf, and with reservations as to insufficient preparation. The only thing I could do to make things easier for myself, and for honest opponents, was to prepare the theses in writing. I read them out and gave the text to Comrade Sorelity. I read them twice very slowly, first at a meeting of Bolsheviks and then at a meeting of both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. I published these personal theses of mine with only the briefest explanatory notes, which were developed in far greater detail in the report. Theses. 1. In our attitude towards the war, which under the new provisional government of Obov and Co. unquestionably remains on Russia's part a predatory imperialist war owing to the capitalist nature of that government. Not the slightest concession to, quote, revolutionary defensism is permissible. The class-conscious proletariat can give its consent to a revolutionary war, which would really justify revolutionary defensism, only on condition A, that the power passed to the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants aligned with the proletariat, B, that all annexations be renounced in deed and not in word, C, that a complete break be effected in actual fact with all capitalist interests. In view of the undoubted honesty of those broad sections of the mass believers in revolutionary defensism who accept the war only as a necessity and not as a means of conquest, in view of the fact that they are being deceived by the bourgeoisie, it is necessary with particular thoroughness, persistence, and patience to explain their error to them, to explain the inseparable connection existing between capital and the imperialist war, and to prove that without overthrowing capital, it is impossible to end the war by a truly democratic peace, a peace not imposed by violence. The most widespread campaign for this view must be organized in the army at the front. Fraternization. 2. The specific feature of the present situation in Russia is that the country is passing from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants. This translation is characterized, on the one hand, by a maximum of legally recognized rights. Russia is now the freest of all the belligerent countries in the world. On the other, by the absence of violence towards the masses, and finally, by their unreasoning trust in the government of capitalists, those worst enemies of peace and socialism. This peculiar situation demands of us an ability to adapt ourselves to the special conditions of party work among unprecedentedly large masses of proletarians who have just awakened to political life. 3. No support for the provisional government. The utter falsity of all its promises should be made clear, particularly of those relating to the renunciation of annexations. Exposure in place of the impermissible, illusion-breeding demand that this government, a government of capitalists, should cease to be an imperialist government. 4. Recognition of the fact that in most of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies, our party is in a minority, so far a small minority, as against a bloc of all the petty bourgeois opportunist elements, from the popular socialists and the socialist revolutionaries down to the organizing committee. Chekaitsa, Tsarelity, etc., Steklov, etc., etc., who have yielded to the influence of the bourgeoisie and spread that influence among the proletariat. The masses must be made to see that the Soviets of Workers' Deputies are the only possible form of revolutionary government, and that therefore our task is, as long as this government yields to the influence of the bourgeoisie, to present a patient, systematic, and persistent explanation of the errors of their tactics, an explanation especially adapted to the practical needs of the masses. As long as we are in the minority, we carry on the work of criticizing and exposing errors, and at the same time we preach the necessity of transferring the entire state power to the Soviets of Workers' Deputies, so that the people may overcome their mistakes by experience. 5. Not a parliamentary republic. To return to a parliamentary republic from the Soviets of Workers' Deputies would be a retrograde step, but a republic of Soviets of workers, agricultural laborers, and peasants' deputies throughout the country from top to bottom. Abolition of the police, the army, and the bureaucracy. The salaries of all officials, all of whom are elective and displaceable at any time, not to exceed the average wage of a competent worker. 6. The weight of emphasis in the agrarian program to be shifted to the Soviets of Agricultural Laborers' Deputies. Confiscation of all landed estates. Nationalization of all lands in the country, the land to be disposed of by the local Soviets of Agricultural Laborers and Peasants' Deputies. The organization of separate Soviets of Deputies of poor peasants. The setting up of a model farm on each of the large estates, ranging in size from 100 to 300 desiatines, according to local and other conditions and to the decisions of the local bodies, under the control of the Soviets of Agricultural Laborers' Deputies and for the public account. 7. the immediate union of all banks in the country into a single national bank, and the institution of control over it by the Soviet of Workers' Deputies. 8. It is not our immediate task to introduce socialism, but only to bring social production and the distribution of products at once under the control of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. 9. Party tasks. A. Immediate convocation of a party congress. B. Alteration of the party program, mainly 1. On the question of imperialism and the imperialist war. 2. On our attitude towards the state and our demand for a commune state. 3. Amendment of our out-of-date minimum program. C. Change of the party's name. 10. A new international. We must take the initiative in creating a revolutionary international, an international against the social chauvinists and against the, quote, center. In order that the reader may understand why I had especially to emphasize as a rare exception the, quote, case of honest opponents, I invite him to compare the above theses with the following objection by Mr. Goldenberg. Lenin, he said, quote, has planted the banner of civil war in the midst of revolutionary democracy, unquote, quoted in number 5 of Mr. Plekhanov's Yedinstvo. Isn't it a gem? I write, announce, and elaborately explain, quote, in view of the undoubted honesty of those broad sections of the mass believers in revolutionary defensism, in view of the fact that they are being deceived by the bourgeoisie, it is necessary with particular thoroughness, persistence, and patience to explain their error to them, unquote. Yet the bourgeois gentlemen who call themselves social democrats, who do not belong either to the broad sections or to the mass believers in defensism, with serene brow, present my views thus, quote, the banner of civil war, unquote, of which there is not a word in these theses and not a word in my speech, has been planted, quote, in the midst of revolutionary democracy, unquote. What does this mean? In what way does this differ from riot-inciting agitation, from Ruskaya Volya? I write, announce, and elaborately explain, quote, the Soviets of Workers' Deputies are the only possible form of revolutionary government, and therefore our task is to present a patient, systematic, and persistent explanation of the errors of their tactics, an explanation especially adapted to the practical needs of the masses, unquote. Yet opponents of a certain brand present my views as a call to, quote, civil war in the midst of revolutionary democracy. I attacked the provisional government for not having appointed an early date or any date at all for the convocation of the Constituent Assembly and for confining itself to promises. I argued that without the Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, the convocation of the Constituent Assembly is not guaranteed and its success is impossible. And the view is attributed to me that I am opposed to the speedy convocation of the Constituent Assembly. I would call this raving, had not decades of political struggle taught me to regard honesty in opponents as a rare exception. Mr. Plekhanov, in his paper, called my speech raving. Very good, Mr. Plekhanov, but look how awkward, uncouth, and slow-witted you are in your polemics. If I delivered a raving speech for 2 hours, how is it that an audience of hundreds tolerated this, quote, raving? Further, why does your paper devote a whole column to an account of this raving? Inconsistent, highly inconsistent. It is, of course, much easier to shout, abuse, and howl than to attempt to relate, to explain, to recall what Marx and Engels said in 1871, 1872, and 1875 about the experience of the Paris Commune, and about the kind of state the proletariat needs. See The Civil War in France and Critique of the Gotha Program. Ex-Marxist Mr. Plekhanov evidently does not care to recall Marxism. I quoted the words of Rosa Luxemburg, who on August 4, 1914, called German social democracy, quote, a stinking corpse. And the Plekhanovs, Goldenbergs, and company feel offended. On whose behalf? On behalf of the German chauvinists, because they were called chauvinists. They have got themselves in a mess, these poor Russian social chauvinists. Socialists in word and chauvinists indeed. And that is the end of the audiobook. There are a couple of notes here. One is that the abolition of the police, the army, and the bureaucracy was to be replaced by the arming of the whole people. The second was that the demand for the commune state that Lenin talked about is, i.e., a state of which the Paris Commune was the prototype, and change of the party's name instead of social democracy, whose leaders throughout the world have betrayed socialism and deserted to the bourgeoisie, such as the defensists and the vacillating Trotskyites. We must call ourselves the Communist Party. So this is the point where, as you read Lenin's earlier works, like What Is to Be Done, he talks about the social democratic efforts, which we now would call communist. This is where he calls for that name change. And then lastly, where he says we must take the initiative in creating a revolutionary international, an international against the social chauvinists and against the center. Meaning the center in the international social democratic movement is the trend which vacillates between the chauvinists, in other words, defensists, and internationalists, i.e. Kautsky and Co. in Germany, Longuet and Co. in France, and Chekaitsa and Co. in Russia, Tarati and Company in Italy, MacDonald and Company in Britain, etc. So that is it. That is the entire end of audiobook. Tasks of the Proletariat in the Present Revolution, aka the April Theses. Of course, this is not, a lengthy theoretical work, but it's, seen as an important work because things were really happening at this time in history that Lenin was in the middle of, and this is a piece where, some key pieces of history take place. So, what do you think? I think that it's interesting to see things like abolition of the police, the army, and the bureaucracy. Of course, we've had major calls to abolish the police. I've been completely supportive of that. Of course, we do have to replace the existing capitalist government with a new government. One of the things I'd like to get into more on Socialism for All is how did this Soviet system work? Lenin makes many calls here to, for the commune state and for the Soviets to take control of, for example, the nationalized land. Well, let's get into the specifics. What were the Soviets? How did they work? How did they get set up? And how would we go about setting up a similar type of system here, let's say in the United States or elsewhere, so that when a revolutionary moment comes out, we have more of a ready-made apparatus for taking power, making a parallel system now. So, that's one of the things I'll be trying to get into in the coming months on this channel. The United States is getting so unstable, it's taking a lot of, putting a lot of working people in absolutely horrible positions. I have endured my share of hardships during this as well. The only upside is that hopefully, as Lenin mentions here, the masses' unreasoning trust in the government of capitalists, which, of course, is a problem for revolutionary socialists, because the capitalists are the enemies of peace and socialism and working class interests in general. How do we peel people away from that? The capitalists in the United States have a great system where they bounce back and forth between the Democrat faction of the 1% and the Republican faction of the 1%. And they've managed to convince, a lot of the fervent believers in both of those camps that it's really just all the other parties' fault, not capitalism as a whole. And in fact, the same donors control both parties. So that said, registered members of the Democratic and Republican parties are like only half of the electorate. So we've already got half the electorate who doesn't buy into that. It is, again, the position of this channel that right now we're in 2020. If we socialists, Marxists, communists engage in the kind of education, agitation, and organizing that I think we're capable of, we could have a revolution by 2030. So on that note, Revolution 2030, let's get out there and do this. This has been Socialism for All. Thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. You can contribute to Socialism for All for as little as $2 a month or as many as $200 a month. Every one of these donations is very encouraging to me, honestly. Of course, the more actual money I get, the more time I can spend on this. I can only kind of spend a few days a month on it right now. You can also follow us at facebook.com/socialismforall, also facebook.com/socialism4all, which is the backup page I made because they're throttling the main page heavily, and we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you in the next video. To modern capitalism. Naturally, Marx was faced with the problem of applying this theory both to the forthcoming collapse of capitalism and to the future development of future communism. On the basis of what facts, then, can the question of the future development of future communism be dealt with? On the basis of the fact that it has its origin in capitalism, that it develops historically from capitalism, that it is the result of the action of a social force to which capitalism gave birth. There is no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to make up a utopia, to indulge in idle guesswork about what cannot be known. Marx treated the question of communism in the same way as a naturalist would treat the question of the development of, say, a new biological variety, once he knew that it had originated in such and such a way and was changing in such and such a definite direction. To begin with, Marx brushed aside the confusion the Gotha program brought into the question of the relationship between state and society. He wrote, quote, "Present-day society is capitalist society, which exists in all civilized countries, being more or less free from medieval admixture, more or less modified by the particular historical development of each country, more or less developed. On the other hand, the present-day state changes with a country's frontier. It is different in the Prusso-German Empire from what it is in Switzerland, and different in England from what it is in the United States. The present-day state is therefore a fiction. Quote, nevertheless, the different states of the different civilized countries, in spite of their motley diversity of form, all have this in common, that they are based on modern bourgeois society, only one more or less capitalistically developed. They have, therefore, also certain essential characteristics in common. In this sense, it is possible to speak of the present-day state in contrast with the future, in which its present root, bourgeois society, will have died off. Quoting again, the question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present state functions? This question can only be answered scientifically, and one does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a thousandfold combination of the word people with the word state, unquote. Comment, that was a little funny. I almost laughed. After thus ridiculing all talk about a people's state, Marx formulated the question and gave warning, as it were, that those seeking a scientific answer to it should use only firmly established scientific data. The first fact that has been established most accurately by the whole theory of development, by science as a whole, a fact that was ignored by the utopians and is ignored by the present-day opportunists, who are afraid of the socialist revolution, is that, historically, there must undoubtedly be a special stage, or a special phase, of transition from capitalism to communism. End of section 1, beginning section 2, the transition from capitalism to communism. Marx continued, quote, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period, in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, unquote. Marx bases this conclusion on an analysis of the role played by the proletariat in modern capitalist society, on the data concerning the development of this society, and on the irreconcilability of the antagonistic interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Previously, the question was put as follows. To achieve its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, win political power, and advance its revolutionary dictatorship. Now the question is put somewhat differently. The transition from capitalist society, which is developing towards communism, to communist society, is impossible without a, quote, political transition period, and the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. What, then, is the relation of this dictatorship to democracy. We have seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two concepts, quote, to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, and, quote, to win the battle of democracy. On the basis of all that has been said above, it is possible to determine more precisely how democracy changes in the transition from capitalism to communism. In capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favorable conditions, we have a more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in effect, a democracy for the minority, only for the propertied classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. Owing to the conditions of capitalist exploitation, the modern wage slaves are so crushed by want and poverty that they, quote, cannot be bothered with democracy, cannot be bothered with politics. In the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participation in public and political life. Quick comment, we see that half of the people in the United States who could vote don't vote. That, I think, is very much a case of being so crushed by want and poverty that they cannot be bothered with democracy or politics. Some of it, of course, as you know, we talk about politics a lot on this channel. Some of it, of course, is, you know, having evaluated the Democrats and the Republicans and the Libertarians, they see that they're all crap who will sell them out. I think definitely part of it's that. When it comes to the question of why don't more people vote PSL or Green or something like that, I think it's definitely a case of the latter, is people are too run down with their day-to-day lives and the horrible poverty that we face to, you know, just stay current at all. Of course, we try to help with people staying informed here, as do other similar channels, but, you know, there are limits and material conditions. When you're working 50, 60 hours a week, it's hard to crack open the news, you know, when you finally get some free time. All right, continuing. The correctness of this statement is perhaps most clearly confirmed by Germany, because constitutional legality steadily endured there for a remarkably long time, nearly half a century, 1871 to 1914. And during this period, the Social Democrats were able to achieve far more than in other countries in the way of, quote, utilizing legality, and organized a larger proportion of the workers into a political party than anywhere else in the world. What is this largest proportion of politically conscious and active wage slaves that has so far been recorded in capitalist society? 1 million members of the Social Democratic Party out of 15 million wage workers, 3 million organized in trade unions out of 15 million. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely into the machinery of capitalist democracy, we see everywhere, in the, quote, petty, supposedly petty, details of the suffrage, residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., in the technique of the representative institutions, in the actual obstacles to the right of assembly, public buildings are not for paupers, etc., in the purely capitalist organization of the daily press, etc., etc., we see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor seem slight, especially in the eyes of one who has never known want himself and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life. And 9 out of 10, if not 99 out of 100, bourgeois publicists and politicians come under this category. But in their sum total, these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics, from active participation in democracy. Comment, well said. That's a very good passage. Marx grasped the essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analyzing the experience of the commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament. But from this capitalist democracy that is inevitably narrow and stealthily pushes aside the poor and is therefore hypocritical and false through and through, forward development does not proceed simply, directly, and smoothly towards greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. Democratic Party. No, forward development, i.e. development towards communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat and cannot do otherwise, for the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Engels expressed this splendidly in his letter to Babel when he said, as the reader will remember, that, quote, the proletariat needs the state, not in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist, unquote. Democracy for the vast majority of the people, and suppression by force, i.e. exclusion from democracy, of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. Only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e. when there is no distinction between the members of society as regards their relation to the social means of production, only then, quote, the state ceases to exist, and, quote, it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and be realized, a democracy without any exceptions whatever. And only then will democracy begin to wither away, owing to the simple fact that, freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state. The expression, the state withers away, is very well known, for it indicates both the gradual and the spontaneous nature of this process. Only habit can, and undoubtedly will, have such an effect, for we see around us on millions of occasions how readily people become accustomed to observing the necessary rules of social intercourse when there is no exploitation, when there is nothing that arouses indignation, evokes protest and revolt, and creates the need for suppression. And so in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters of the minority. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy, and the more complete it is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away of its own accord. In other words, under capitalism, we have the state in another sense of the word. That is, a special machine for the suppression of one class by another, and what is more, of the majority by the minority. Naturally, to be successful, such an undertaking as the systematic suppression of the exploited majority by the exploiting minority calls for the utmost ferocity and savagery in the matter of suppressing. It calls for seas of blood, through which mankind is actually wading its way in slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is now the suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, the state, is still necessary, but this is now a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple, and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the risings of slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and it will cost mankind far less. And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for a special machine of suppression will begin to disappear. Naturally, the exploiters are unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task, but the people can suppress the exploiters even with a very simple machine, almost without a machine, without a special apparatus, by the simple organization of the armed people, such as the Soviets of the workers' and soldiers' deputies, we would remark, running ahead. So a quick comment, speaking of running ahead, I'll run ahead a little bit. So, of course, this discussion is mainly, at least implicitly, describing actions within a particular society. But if we pull back a little bit and think about international relations, it could be argued that one of the major problems contributing to the Soviet Union's eventual ripeness for defeat was the huge military buildup that the United States in particular was able to bait them into undertaking. In a way, this is the exact opposite of the withering away of the state, because perhaps within the society where the workers' state has power to suppress the bourgeoisie, they're unable to do so outside of that government's jurisdiction. So you still have bourgeoisie running around and trying to oppress the whole of the country from the outside. So this opens up entirely new questions, which beginning socialists often struggle with. Is, does socialism have to happen everywhere in the world at once, or like how does this happen? In fact, there are very famous disputes within socialism. For example, the dispute between Trotsky and Stalin not long after the founding of the Soviet Union on the question of permanent revolution, or in other words, immediately trying to take on capitalist Europe again and turn it socialist, or do you focus just on building a better socialism and stabilizing the country that your government actually has control of? And what do you do then? It's the question of how does, once you have secured socialism in one location, what is the role of the state in addressing the rest of capitalist exploitation in the rest of the world? So, huge questions, interesting questions, and let's continue on with the text, and we'll see what is left to discuss at the end in the comments. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of The State and Revolution by V.I. Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this is an audiobook of The State and Revolution, the Marxist Theory of the State, and the Tasks of the Proletariat in the Revolution by V.I. Lenin. It was originally written from August to September 1917. The source is Collected Works, Volume 25. First published in 1918. HTML transcription by Zodiac and Brian Baggins. The online version is from the Lenin Internet Archive at Marxists.org, 1993-1999. And thanks as usual to Marxists.org, the Marxists Internet Archive, for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So the only note before we get into the text itself from Socialism for All is that this is the 7th entry in the Marxism-Leninism Basic Study Plan curriculum from the Anti-Imperialism Movement, or Movimiento Anti-Imperialista, MAI. We have a playlist going on the channel. If you go to the Playlists tab on the channel, you will find that playlist and many others of videos that we have put together on socialism. The preceding entry in this playlist is Lenin's What Is to Be Done. The next entry that we'll be putting up from this playlist is Lenin's The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, coming soon to the channel. Okay, that's the end of notes from S4A, so let's get into the text. The text starts with a note from the Lenin Internet Archive. Lenin wrote The State and Revolution in August and September 1917, when he was in hiding from persecution of the provisional government. The need for such a theoretical work as this was mentioned by Lenin in the second half of 1916. It was then that he wrote his note on the Youth International, in which he criticized Bukharin's position on the question of the state and promised to write a detailed article on what he thought to be the Marxist attitude to the state. In a letter to A.M. Kollontai on February 17, 1917, he said that he had almost got ready material on that question. This material was written in a small blue-covered notebook headed Marxism on the State. In it, Lenin had collected quotations from the works of Marx and Engels and extracts from the books by Kautsky, Pannekoek, and Bernstein with his own critical notes, conclusions, and generalizations. When Lenin left Switzerland for Russia in April 1917, he feared arrest by the provisional government and left the manuscript of Marxism on the State behind, as it would have been destroyed had he been caught. When in hiding after the July events, Lenin wrote in a note, quote, "Entre nous, if I am knocked off, I ask you to publish my notebook, Marxism on the State. It got held up in Stockholm. It is bound in a blue cover. All the quotations from Marx and Engels are collected there, also those from Kautsky against Pannekoek. There are a number of remarks, notes, and formulas. I think a week's work would be enough to publish it. I consider it important because not only Plekhanov, but Kautsky too, is confused." Unquote. When Lenin received his notebook from Stockholm, he used the material he had collected as a basis for his book, The State and Revolution. According to Lenin's plan, The State and Revolution was to have consisted of 7 chapters, but he did not write the 7th, the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and only a detailed plan has remained. In a note to the publisher, Lenin wrote that if he, quote, was too slow in completing this, the 7th chapter, or should it turn out to be too bulky, the first 6 chapters should be published separately as Book 1. Originally, the name F.F. Ivanovsky is shown on the first page of the notebook manuscript as that of the author. Lenin intended to publish the book under that pseudonym, otherwise the provisional government would have confiscated it for his name alone. The book, however, was not printed until 1918, when there was no longer any need for the pseudonym. The second edition appeared in 1919. In this revision, Lenin added to Chapter 2 a new section, the presentation of the question by Marx in 1852. That's the end of that section. Just to comment quickly on the timeline here. So, of course, the October Revolution in 1917 is when the Bolsheviks took power. That's why Lenin no longer needed to use a pseudonym. And the provisional government from which he was hiding was the government that was established by the Russian bourgeoisie after the Tsar was deposed in the February Revolution in 1917. So it was during this eventful year that Lenin wrote this work, and, well, quite a lot happened. Okay, on to the preface to the first edition. The question of the state is now acquiring particular importance, both in theory and in practical politics. The imperialist war has immensely accelerated and intensified the process of transformation of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism. The monstrous oppression of the working people by the state, which is merging more and more with the all-powerful capitalist associations, is becoming increasingly monstrous. The advanced countries, we mean their hinterland, are becoming military convict prisons for the workers. The unprecedented horrors and miseries of the protracted war are making the people's position unbearable and increasing their anger. The world proletarian revolution is clearly maturing. The question of its relation to the state is acquiring practical importance. The elements of opportunism that accumulated over the decades of comparatively peaceful development have given rise to the trend of social chauvinism, which dominated the official socialist parties throughout the world. This trend, socialism in words and chauvinism in deeds, Plekhanov, Patrusov, Breshkovskaya, Rubanovich, and in a slightly veiled form, Tsereteli, Chernov and Co. in Russia, Scheirman, Legine, David, and others in Germany, Renaudel, Gesta, and Vandervelde in France and Belgium, Hindman and the Fabians in England, etc., etc., is conspicuous for the base, servile adaptation of the, quote, leaders of socialism to the interests not only of their national bourgeoisie, but of their state, for the majority of the so-called great powers have long been exploiting and enslaving a whole number of small and weak nations. And the imperialist war is a war for the division and redivision of this kind of booty. The struggle to free the working people from the influence of the bourgeoisie in general, and of the imperialist bourgeoisie in particular, is impossible without a struggle against opportunist prejudices concerning the state. First of all, we examine the theory of Marx and Engels of the state, and dwell in particular detail on those aspects of this theory which are ignored or have been distorted by the opportunists. Then we deal specially with the one who is chiefly responsible for these distortions, Karl Kautsky, the best-known leader of the Second International, 1889 to 1914, which has met with such miserable bankruptcy in the present war. Lastly, we sum up the main results of the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905, and particularly of 1917. Apparently, the latter is now, early August 1917, completing the first stage of its development, but this revolution as a whole can only be understood as a link in a chain of socialist proletarian revolutions being caused by the imperialist war. The question of the relation of the socialist proletarian revolution to the state, therefore, is acquiring not only practical political importance, but also the significance of a most urgent problem of the day, the problem of explaining to the masses what they will have to do before long to free themselves from capitalist tyranny. The author, August 1917. That's the end of the preface to the first edition, now beginning the preface to the second edition. The present second edition is published virtually unaltered, except that Section 3 has been added to Chapter 2. Signed, the author, Moscow, December 17, 1918. And that's the end of that preface. Moving on now to Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. Section 1. The State, a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. What is now happening to Marx's theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names, to a certain extent, for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now, quote, Marxists, don't laugh. And more frequently, German bourgeois scholars, only yesterday specialists in the annihilation of Marxism, are speaking of the, quote, national German Marx, who they claim educated the labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of waging a predatory war. In these circumstances, in view of the unprecedentedly widespread distortion of Marxism, our prime task is to re-establish what Marx really taught on the subject of the state. This will necessitate a number of long quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves. Of course, long quotations will render the text cumbersome and not help at all to make it popular reading, but we cannot possibly dispense with them. All, or at any rate, all the most essential passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state must by all means be quoted as fully as possible, so that the reader may form an independent opinion of the totality of the views of the founders of scientific socialism, and of the evolution of those views, and so that their distortion by the Kautskyism now prevailing may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. Let us begin with the most popular of Engels' works, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, the 6th edition of which was published in Stuttgart as far back as 1894. We have to translate the quotations from the German originals, as the Russian translations, while very numerous, are for the most part either incomplete or very unsatisfactory. Summing up his historical analysis, Engels says, quote, "The state is, therefore, by no means a power forced on society from without. Just as little is it the reality of the ethical idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves and society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power, seemingly standing above society, that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order, and this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it, and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state," unquote. This expresses with perfect clarity the basic idea of Marxism with regard to the historical role and the meaning of the state. The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable. It is on this most important and fundamental point that the distortion of Marxism, proceeding along two main lines, begins. On the one hand, the bourgeois, and particularly the petty bourgeois, ideologists, compelled under the weight of indisputable historical facts to admit that the state only exists where there are class antagonisms and a class struggle, quote, correct Marx, in such a way as to make it appear that the state is an organ for the reconciliation of classes. According to Marx, the state could neither have arisen nor maintained itself had it been possible to reconcile classes. From what the petty bourgeois and Philistine professors and publicists say, with quite frequent and benevolent references to Marx, it appears that the state does reconcile classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of, quote, order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, however, order means the reconciliation of classes, and not the oppression of one class by another. To alleviate the conflict means reconciling classes, and not depriving the oppressed classes of definite means and methods of struggle to overthrow their oppressors. For instance, when, in the Revolution of 1917, the question of the significance and role of the state arose in all its magnitude as a practical question demanding immediate action, and, moreover, action on a mass scale, all the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks descended at once to the petty bourgeois theory that the, quote, state, quote, reconciles classes. Comment, social revolutionaries and Mensheviks are basically what we would call radlibs and sockdems today. Continuing, innumerable resolutions and articles by politicians of both these parties are thoroughly saturated with this petty bourgeois and Philistine reconciliation theory, that the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, the class opposite to it, is something the petty bourgeois Democrats will never be able to understand. Their attitude to the state is one of the most striking manifestations of the fact that our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, a point that we Bolsheviks have always maintained, but petty bourgeois Democrats using near-socialist phraseology. Comment, that's exactly, so what I always say radlibs are liberals using radical language. That's exactly it right there. Continuing. On the other hand, the Kautskyite distortion of Marxism is far more subtle. Quote, theoretically, it is not denied that the state is an organ of class rule, or that class antagonisms are irreconcilable. But what is overlooked or glossed over is this: if the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society and, quote, alienating itself more and more from it, it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power, which was created by the ruling class, and which is the embodiment of this, quote, alienation. As we shall see later, Marx very explicitly drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion on the strength of a concrete historical analysis of the tasks of the revolution. And, as we shall show in detail further on, it is this conclusion which Kautsky has, quote, forgotten and distorted. Section 2. Special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc. Engels continues, quote, as distinct from the old Gentile, tribal or clan order, the state first divides its subjects according to territory, unquote. This division seems natural to us, but it costs a prolonged struggle against the old organization, according to generations or tribes. Quote, the second distinguishing feature is the establishment of a public power, which no longer directly coincides with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because a self-acting armed organization of the population has become impossible since the split into classes. This public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds, of which Gentile, clan society knew nothing, unquote. Engels elucidates the concept of the power which is called the state, a power which arose from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc. at their command. We are justified in speaking of special bodies of armed men because the public power, which is an attribute of every state, quote, does not directly coincide with the armed population, with its, quote, self-acting armed organization. Like all great revolutionary thinkers, Engels tries to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers to what prevailing Philistinism regards as least worthy of attention, as the most habitual thing, hallowed by prejudices that are not only deep-rooted, but, one might say, petrified. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power, but how can it be otherwise? From the viewpoint of the vast majority of Europeans at the end of the 19th century, whom Engels was addressing, and who had not gone through or closely observed a single great revolution, it could not have been otherwise. They could not understand at all what a, quote, self-acting armed organization of the population was. When asked why it became necessary to have special bodies of armed men placed above society and alienating themselves from it, police and a standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines are inclined to utter a few phrases borrowed from Spencer of Mikhailovsky to refer to the growing complexity of social life, the differentiation of functions, and so on. Such a reference seems scientific and effectively lulls the ordinary person to sleep by obscuring the important and basic fact, namely the split of society into irreconcilable antagonistic classes. Were it not for this split, the quote, self-acting armed organization of the population would differ from the primitive organization of a stick-wielding herd of monkeys, or of primitive men, or of men united in clans by its complexity, its high technical level, and so on. But such an organization would still be possible. It is impossible because civilized society is split into antagonistic and, moreover, irreconcilably antagonistic classes whose self-acting arming would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state arises, a special power is created, special bodies of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, shows us the naked class struggle, clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving the exploited instead of the exploiters.
So we'll end there. I'm going to skip the reading tonight because I've been going a little too late. And I'm tired. So please like, share, and subscribe. And train every day. Do your daily routine of running, martial arts, body weight exercises, yoga, meditation, and reading. I'll see you tomorrow.